200 silent Apache warriors don't surround a lone man's desert dojo by mistake. They come for justice, for vengeance, or for war. Mr. Kane was about to discover which, and why they believed he was the cause. The Arizona sun was a merciless god, casting the world in bleached gold and sharp, black shadows. In the heart of this unforgiving landscape, nestled between towering saguaros that stood like silent sentinels, was a place that didn't belong. It was a dojo, its clean lines and dark stain were a stark contrast to the chaotic beauty of the desert. The walls were adobe, the color of dried blood, but the gate was a traditional Japanese torii, and the roof had the gentle, sweeping curves of the East. This was the sanctuary of Mr. Kane. Kane moved through his morning kata on the polished wooden deck, his tall, powerful frame clad in simple white cotton. A black ponytail, streaked with silver, swayed in rhythm with his movements. His feet whispered across the boards, a dance of fluid power and absolute control. Each turn, each block, each imagined strike was not an act of aggression, but a conversation with the space around him. He wasn't fighting the desert, he was aligning himself with its raw, potent energy. For a man who had spent decades in the loud, chaotic world of shadows and whispers, a world of government contracts and deniable operations, this silence was the ultimate luxury. Here, the only politics were the slow crawl of a scorpion and the sudden dive of a hawk. It was then that he felt it. A flicker. A disturbance in the desert's natural rhythm, a faint tremor in the key of the landscape. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a fragile, discordant note in a vast, silent symphony. His movements paused, his head tilting slightly. His eyes, the color of dark, still water, scanned the horizon. Most people would have seen nothing but shimmering heat and distant mesas. Kane saw the narrative of the land. He saw where a coyote had passed an hour before, the subtle bend in a clump of brittlebush, the unnatural stillness where a lizard should have been sunning itself. And then, he saw the source of the disturbance. A small figure, stumbling through the shimmering heat haze. It was a child, moving with the agonizingly slow, unsteady gait of someone whose energy had run out miles ago. Kane's meditative calm did not break, but a new focus sharpened within it. He moved off the deck, his bare feet silent on the hot, packed earth. He didn't run, he flowed, his long strides eating up the distance with deceptive speed. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a heart-wrenching image. It was a young girl, no older than 8 or 9. Her traditional Apache dress, once vibrant with color, was ripped and faded, caked with dust. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. But it was her eyes that struck him. They were huge, dark pools of fierce pride fighting a losing battle against utter desperation. She looked up as he approached, her small body tensing, ready to flee, but her legs refused to obey. Kane stopped a respectful distance away, his hands held open and visible at his sides. He said nothing, knowing that words in his language would only be a source of fear. He simply stood, a calm, unthreatening presence. He was a mountain, and mountains do not give chase. The girl watched him, her breath coming in shallow rasps. Finally, her need overwhelmed her fear. She took one more stumbling step and collapsed. Kane was there before she hit the ground, scooping her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and spirit. As he carried her toward the dojo, he felt the faint, rapid flutter of her heart against his chest. It was a life clinging to existence by the thinnest of threads. This was an unnatural imbalance, a violation of the natural order that his entire philosophy was built to correct. Protecting the weak wasn't just an act of compassion, it was an act of restoring harmony. Inside, the dojo was cool and sparse. He laid her gently on a simple woven mat in the main training hall. He moved with quiet efficiency, retrieving a canteen of water and a clean cloth. He wet her lips first, then gave her a few drops to swallow, careful not to let her drink too quickly. Her eyes fluttered open, fixing on him with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. As he tended to her, a small object, dislodged from the folds of her dress, fell onto the dark wood floor. It wasn't a cheap bead necklace or a common trinket. It was a small, exquisitely crafted medicine pouch, made of soft deer hide and stitched with a pattern of turquoise and obsidian chips. The pattern was unique, symbolic. From his years operating in these territories, from briefings and back-alley dealings with tribal informants, Kane recognized it. It wasn't just any Apache design. It was the personal sigil of the family of a man named Taza, known to the world as Stone Fist, the most revered and feared Apache chieftain in the region. His hand froze. He wasn't just saving a lost child. He was holding the daughter of a living legend, a man who could command 200 warriors with a single word. And that man's daughter had just vanished on his doorstep. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Nita, drifted into an exhausted sleep. Kane covered her with a light wool blanket, his mind a placid lake on the surface, but with deep currents moving beneath. The discovery of the medicine pouch had fundamentally altered the equation. This was no longer a simple act of humanitarian aid. It was now a delicate, high-stakes diplomatic incident, and he was the sole, unelected ambassador. He knew the protocols. He should have immediately attempted to contact Stone Fist's people, to send a signal of peace and announce his intentions. But the girl was too weak to travel, and any lone approach he made to an Apache encampment, especially now, would likely be met with an arrow first and questions later. He was caught in a lethal paradox. The act of saving her life was putting his own in jeopardy. He spent the next few hours making a thin, nourishing broth on the small stove in his living quarters. The scent of herbs and simmering stock filled the dojo, a comforting aroma in a tense atmosphere. Nita woke as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. She accepted the broth without a word, sipping it slowly from a simple ceramic bowl, her dark eyes never leaving his face. They were watchful, intelligent, trying to decipher the nature of the strange, quiet giant who had saved her. The sharp crunch of tires on the gravel road outside shattered the evening calm. It was a sound of aggression, a sound that didn't belong in his world of deliberate silence. Kane's body didn't tense, but a stillness fell over him, the focused calm of a predator that has detected a rival. He glanced through the window. A dusty, white county sheriff's vehicle had skidded to a halt by the Torii gate. A heavy-set man in a tight, sweat-stained uniform climbed out, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his pistol. Sheriff Hackett. Hackett was a man who saw the world in black and white, and Kane, with his strange dojo and quiet ways, was a shade of gray he deeply distrusted. He represented a brand of local authority that was built on suspicion and blunt force, a philosophy diametrically opposed to Kane's. Kane. Hackett's voice boomed across the yard, a bullhorn of misplaced confidence. I know you're in there. Got a report of suspicious activity. Figured I'd start with the local weirdo. Kane met him at the gate, stepping outside so the confrontation would remain clear of the dojo and the resting child. He simply stood there, his presence a silent question. Don't give me that silent treatment crap, Hackett spat, his face flushed. He gestured vaguely toward the hills. The Apaches are on the warpath. Stone Fist's kid went missing a couple of days ago during a storm. They're turning over every rock and spooking all the ranchers. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? You always seemed a little too friendly with the natives for my taste. Kane's expression remained unreadable. The law requires you to have a warrant to enter my property, Sheriff. Hackett's eyes narrowed. You listen to me. I've got terrified citizens calling me, saying they're seeing Apache riders all over the foothills. They're looking for someone or something to blame. A man like you, living out here alone, no friends, practicing your weird karate, you're an easy target. Now, I'm gonna ask you one more time. Have you seen a little Apache girl? The choice was clear. Lie, and by a few hours. Tell the truth, and bring the full weight of Hackett's prejudice and incompetence crashing down upon this fragile situation. Kane's code was simple, never lie, but never give your enemy a weapon. Hackett was, in this moment, an enemy of peace. "I am aware of the situation," Kane said, his voice low and even. "It is being handled." "Handled?" Hackett let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What's that supposed to mean? You got her in there, don't you?" He took a step forward, trying to peer past Kane's shoulder. "I have a right to." Kane shifted his weight. It was a minuscule movement, no more than an inch, but it fundamentally changed his posture. He went from being a man standing still to being a man rooted to the very core of the earth. His energy seemed to solidify in the space between them, an invisible wall that Hackett felt on a primal level. The sheriff stopped dead, his bravado faltering. "You have no rights on this property without just cause and a judge's signature," Kane stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are escalating a situation you do not understand. I suggest you leave." For a moment, Hackett looked like he might draw his weapon. His hand twitched. But something in Kane's eyes, a depth, a certainty, a complete absence of fear, made him reconsider. It was the look of a man who had faced far worse than a rural sheriff with an attitude problem. Defeated, Hackett backed away toward his car, his face a mask of bitter resentment. "Fine. Have it your way, freak," he snarled, yanking his car door open. "But when Stone Fist and his war party show up here, don't come crying to me. I got a call into the state patrol, but they're hours away. You think they'll start a war with the whole Apache nation for one strange hermit? You're on your own." He slammed the door and peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury hanging in the air. Kane stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle. Hackett's visit had done more than just confirm his fears. It had removed the board from the chess game entirely. There was no outside help. There was no official channel. He was now utterly alone, a tiny island of calm between the storm of Apache justice and the tide of local prejudice. As night fell, a profound silence descended upon the desert, deeper and more complete than the silence of the day. But this was a charged silence, heavy with anticipation. Kane sat in Siza on the floor of the main hall, a single oil lamp casting a warm, flickering glow on the walls. Across from him, Nita was curled under the blanket, her eyes wide and alert. The broth had restored some of her strength, and with it, her awareness of the danger they were in. Then, the sound began. It wasn't the cliché thrumming of war drums he'd heard in movies. It was something far more ancient and unnerving. It started as a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself, a rhythmic pulse you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. Soon, it was joined by a low, guttural chanting from dozens of throats, a sound that was both a lament and a threat. Interspersed were the sharp clicks of wood on wood and the occasional metallic scrape, the sounds of a disciplined, armed body of men moving as one. This was not a chaotic mob. This was a warband, moving with purpose, and every beat of their march was a step closer to his door. Nita sat bolt upright, her small body trembling. She understood the meaning of those sounds intimately. Her eyes locked with Kane's, and for the first time, she tried to communicate with urgency. She pointed a small finger toward the window, then held up both hands, fingers splayed. She closed them and opened them again. And again. 10. 20. She continued, her movements becoming more frantic, until she had mimed the number 200. Her point was terrifyingly clear. Kane gave a slow, deliberate nod to show he understood. He rose in a single, fluid motion and walked not to a gun rack, but to a simple wooden chest in the corner of his living quarters. From it, he removed a clean, black kikaji, the traditional uniform for his martial arts practice. He methodically changed out of his day clothes, his movements precise and ceremonial. This was not a preparation for a fight. It was a preparation for a meeting. By donning the uniform of his discipline, he was choosing to face this crisis not as a settler or a hermit, but as a man of a specific code, a warrior in his own right. It was a sign of respect for himself, and for the warriors who were coming for him. He re-entered the main hall just as the sounds from outside stopped. The abrupt silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. He went to the window and peered out into the moon-drenched landscape. At first, he saw nothing but the silvered silhouettes of the cacti. Then, as if the shadows themselves were giving birth, they appeared. Shapes on horseback, materializing from the darkness. They were arranged in a wide, perfect semicircle, slowly, silently, tightening the ring around his isolated dojo. The moonlight caught the glint of lance tips, the dark streaks of war paint on stoic faces, the feathers braided into long, black hair. They moved with a spectral grace, their ponies' hooves making no sound on the sandy soil. They were ghosts with weapons, an army of righteous phantoms come to claim a debt. Nita let out a small, stifled cry. She scrambled to her feet and ran to Kane, tugging on the sleeve of his uniform. She pointed to herself, then to the door, a desperate look on her face. She wanted to go to them, to show them she was alive and unharmed. Kane understood her intent, but he also understood the razor's edge they were on. If he sent her out alone, they might see it as a coward's move. If he stepped out with her, his presence might be seen as a captor's threat. Every possible action was a gamble, with his life and the peace of the entire region as the stakes. A single voice, powerful and clear, cut through the night. It spoke in perfect, if heavily accented, English. Man of the silent house. We know what you hold. We know who you hold. Send out the daughter of Stone Fist now. And we will let the spirits decide if you live to see the dawn. It was a declaration, an ultimatum, and a judgment all in one. Kane closed his eyes for a brief second, his mind achieving a state of absolute clarity. The time for waiting was over. The meeting had begun. Kane did not hesitate. He slid the heavy wooden door open and stepped out onto the engawa, the narrow veranda that wrapped around the dojo. The cool night air felt electric on his skin. With his hands held loosely at his sides, he stood in the full moonlight, a solitary figure in black against the warm glow of the lamplight from within. A moment later, Nita followed, her small hand instinctively gripping the hem of his hakama. She was afraid, but she had chosen to stand with him. The sight before them was biblical in its scope and menace. 200 Apache warriors sat on their ponies, forming a flawless, suffocating circle around the dojo. Every eye was on Kane. Every weapon, from rifles to bows to hand-carved lances, was pointed in his direction. At the very front of the formation, mounted on a powerful black warhorse, was a man whose presence eclipsed all others. It could only be Stone Fist. He was massive, with shoulders as broad as a boulder. Silver streaked his long, black hair, which flowed freely over a chest crisscrossed with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. His face, illuminated by the moon, was a masterpiece of granite and resolve, and his eyes burned with a cold, contained fury that promised nothing but retribution. Papa. Nita's small voice pierced the tension. She let go of Kane's clothes and ran across the packed earth toward the chieftain. Stone Fist swung down from his horse with a warrior's grace, kneeling to catch his daughter in his arms. But the joyful reunion Kane had hoped for did not happen. The chief's expression grew even darker as he held her, his hands running over her arms and face, checking for injury. Nita began speaking in a rapid torrent of Apache, her small hands gesturing back toward Kane, the dojo, the bowl of broth. Kane could not understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language. Every muscle in Stone Fist's body was coiled like a steel spring, ready to explode. Whatever Nita was telling him, it wasn't enough. Finally, the chief stood, leaving Nita with another warrior. He walked toward Kane, his steps slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. The other warriors remained mounted, but there was a collective shift, the subtle sound of 200 weapons being adjusted, like the hiss of 1,000 rattlesnakes. Stone Fist stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough for Kane to see the intricate beadwork on his vest and the profound weariness in his otherwise implacable eyes. My daughter tells me you gave her water. That you gave her food, the chief said, his English precise and cold. She tells me you gave her shelter from the sun. She was dying, Kane replied, his own voice steady, calm. I did what anyone would do. Not anyone, Stone Fist corrected, his gaze unwavering. A white man would have shot her for trespassing. A rancher would have seen her as a pest. You are neither. What are you? I am a man who believes in balance, Kane said. Her life was in jeopardy. That is an imbalance. I sought to correct it. Stone Fist considered this for a long moment. She also tells me you saw the medicine pouch of our family. You recognized the sigil of my ancestors. You knew she was my blood. Yet you did not immediately try to return her. Why? Did you mean to use her as a bargaining chip? To trade her back to us for safe passage, for gold? The accusation, spoken in that resonant voice, hung in the night air, thick and poisonous. The weight of 400 eyes pressed down on Kane, each pair waiting for the signal to unleash a volley of death. I intended to ensure she was strong enough to travel, Kane answered truthfully. Her life was the only priority. Your claim to her was secondary to her claim to life. This philosophical answer seemed to give the chief pause. He gestured for Kane to step aside, and he walked past him into the open dojo. Kane followed, Nita trailing behind them both. The chief's eyes swept across the room, taking in the stark simplicity, the polished floors, the weapon racks holding only wooden training swords, the scent of sandalwood incense. But his gaze, and the gaze of the warriors peering in from the darkness, was drawn to one spot. On a small, low table in the corner sat a simple altar. On it, there was no picture of a wife or child. Instead, there was a single, framed, black and white photograph. It showed an old, wizened Japanese man in a formal Motsuki Haori hakama, his face a roadmap of deep lines, but his eyes bright with wisdom and inner peace. Next to the photo lay a small, polished stone and a single, perfectly folded black belt. Stone Fist approached the altar slowly. He looked at the photograph, then at Kane, then back at the photograph. The anger in his expression did not vanish, but it was joined by a new element, curiosity. This man, Stone Fist said, his voice softer now, almost a murmur. He has the eyes of a chief. He was your elder. The question was a test. Kane knew that in Apache culture, the respect one showed to their elders was a sacred duty. He was my sensei, Kane replied, his voice laced with a deep, quiet reverence. My teacher. The man who showed me the path, the do. He is the reason I am who I am. Stone Fist reached out, but did not touch the photograph. He understood. This was not a shrine to a dead family member, it was a shrine to a legacy. It was a testament to a code, a discipline, a way of life passed from master to student. He, a chief who had inherited the wisdom and burdens of generations of his own people, recognized the sanctity of that bond. It was a language of honor that transcended culture. A man who honors his teacher understands the value of a bloodline, Stone Fist said quietly, almost to himself. He turned back to Kane. My warriors came here tonight for vengeance. They expected to find a monster, a kidnapper who had stolen the future of our tribe. They expected to burn this house of strange spirits to the ground. He paused, his eyes locking with Kane's. Instead, I find a man who honors his ancestors and gives shelter to a lost child. This has complicated things. But even as a flicker of hope ignited in Kane's chest, he heard restless movements from the warriors outside. He could hear their murmurs, the impatient stomp of a horse. 200 men had come for blood, not for a philosophical debate. Disappointment in a war party was a dangerous fuel. But a complication is not a resolution, Stone Fist continued, his voice hardening again. You have created a situation that honor demands be settled. My people cried for justice. Justice has not yet been served. A warrior detached himself from the silent ranks outside and strode into the dojo. He was younger than Stone Fist, his face a mask of raw fury, his body taut with aggression. A fresh, jagged scar ran down his cheek, a testament to a recent and violent past. This was Blood Lance, a man whose brother had been killed in a skirmish with prospectors 2 seasons ago. His grief had since curdled into a white-hot hatred for all outsiders. "Great Chief," he exclaimed in Apache, his voice ringing with challenge. "You speak with this man as if he were a brother. He is Inda, an enemy. He touched your daughter, a daughter of the people. Our law is clear. His life is forfeit." He punctuated his words by slamming the butt of his lance onto the wooden floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. Several warriors outside murmured their assent. The solid discipline of the warband was beginning to fracture. Stone Fist turned slowly, his face impassive but his eyes flashing with dangerous light. This man did not harm her, Blood Lance. He gave her aid. His aid is a poison. Blood Lance retorted, stepping closer. He pointed his lance not at the chief, but directly at Kane's chest. "He taints her with his foreign ways in his foreign house. If your heart has grown soft, Stone Fist, then mine has not. I will uphold the honor of our tribe. I will take his blood as payment and wash the stain from your daughter." The lance shot forward, a blur of motion aimed directly at Kane's heart. What happened next was over in less than a second. It was not an act of violence, but of pure, sublime control. Kane didn't block or strike back. As the lance tip flew toward him, he pivoted on the ball of his left foot, his body flowing around the attack like water around a stone. His right hand came up, not to grab the weapon, but to gently guide it, his fingers brushing against the wooden shaft. He used Blood Lance's own furious momentum, his own forward-driving energy, against him. Kane's body continued to turn, a whirlwind of black cloth and controlled force. Blood Lance, propelled by his own lunge and Kane's subtle redirection, was pulled off balance. The lance point slid harmlessly past Kane's ear as the warrior stumbled forward. Kane's other hand found Blood Lance's wrist, not in a crushing grip, but with a firm, precise hold on the pressure points. With a final, fluid twist of his hips, he brought the warrior down to one knee, his lance clattering to the floor. The entire dojo held its breath. Kane had not struck a single blow. He had simply absorbed an attack and neutralized it, as effortlessly as the desert absorbs the rain. He held Blood Lance in place for a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Then, he released his grip and took a step back. "In this house," Kane said, his voice still unnervingly calm, "we do not answer anger with anger." The display of a power so absolute yet so restrained left the Apaches speechless. They understood battle, force, and killing blows. They did not understand this. This was a different kind of strength, one that seemed to come from a deeper, quieter source. It was Nita who broke the spell. She ran forward and stood between the kneeling Blood Lance and the towering form of Kane. She placed her small hands on her hips and began to speak, her young voice cutting through the stunned silence with the clarity of a silver bell. Stone Fist watched, his expression unreadable, and began to translate quietly for Kane's benefit. She is telling him what happened. How she was lost in the storm. How she drank from a poison pool and grew sick. How she was ready to lie down and let the spirits take her. Nita's voice grew stronger. She pointed at Kane, then mimicked his movements from that morning, not a fighting stance, but the slow, deliberate grace of his kata. Then she mimicked his quiet posture when facing Sheriff Hackett at the gate. "Now she tells them you are not a fighter," Stone Fist murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "She says, your power does not come from a desire to harm, but from a desire for stillness. She is telling them you are a Nantan, a guardian, not a warrior." Finally, she turned to the stunned Blood Lance. Her voice softened, but her words carried an unexpected weight. She asks him if he has children, the chief translated, his own voice thick with emotion. She asks what he would want a stranger to do if he found his own child dying in the wilderness. Would he want justice, or would he want mercy? Blood Lance stared at the small girl, his rage finally extinguished by the simple, undeniable truth in her words. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a profound confusion, and then, a flicker of shame. He looked at his lance on the floor, then at Kane, who stood watching, his presence as calm and immovable as the sacred mountains on the horizon. Slowly, the shamed warrior picked up his weapon, bowed his head slightly toward his chief, and retreated back into the darkness outside. The challenge was over. The crisis had passed its peak. The ride to the Apache stronghold was not one of a prisoner, but of an honored, if mysterious, guest. Kane rode alongside Stone Fist, a small contingent of warriors escorting them through secret canyons and hidden trails that were invisible on any white man's map. The moon was their guide, and the ancient land held its breath as they passed. They didn't travel to the main village, but upward, toward a flat-topped mesa that loomed against the stars, the tribe's sacred mountain, a place of council and ceremony. A great fire burned in the center of a circle of 7 elders. These were the keepers of the tribe's wisdom, men whose faces were landscapes of time and hardship. Kane was given a place to stand in the center, the heat of the fire on his face, the cold of the desert at his back. He felt the weight of centuries of history in the gazes of the old men. Stone Fist spoke first, his voice resonating with authority. He recounted the entire story, from the news of his daughter's disappearance to the events in the dojo. He spoke of the medicine pouch, the shrine to the sensei, and the strange, non-violent way Kane had disarmed Blood Lance. When he finished, one of the elders looked at Kane and spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The chief speaks of a new kind of power," Stone Fist translated. "One that does not seek to conquer. Our elders find this difficult to understand. For us, power has always been the lance, the bow, the rifle. It is the strength to protect our people from a world that wishes us erased." The debate went on for what felt like hours. Kane stood in patient silence, understanding that he was not the subject of the trial, but the catalyst. This was a crucible for the Apache soul, a debate between the old ways of vengeance and the possibility of a new path. Finally, Nita was called forward. She stood before the elders, small and straight, and spoke with a calm conviction that belied her age. When she finished, the most ancient of the elders, a man whose eyes seemed to hold the memory of the tribe's entire history, asked her a single question. Her answer was immediate and unwavering. Stone Fist turned to Kane, his face lit by the firelight. He asked her if she believes you. If she truly believes that your heart holds no deceit, and that you would risk your own life again to save another of our children, knowing what it might cost you. The chief paused. She said yes. A long silence fell over the council. The old men conferred in whispers. At last, the ancient elder stood, his joints creaking with the effort. He spoke, and Stone Fist translated his final judgment. He says the spirits have sent us not an enemy, but a test. A test of our wisdom. It is easy to show strength against a foe. It is harder to show wisdom to a friend you do not yet understand. He says your path, your due, is strange to us, but its fruits are clear. You saved the life of our future. The elder looked directly at Kane. You will be granted not just safe passage, but the protection of our people. This dojo of yours will be considered a place of peace, under our watch. Any who would harm you or your sanctuary will have to answer to this council. Thank you, Kane said, his voice quiet. I am honored. There is a condition, the chief continued. A covenant. You must promise that your door will always be open. That if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or seeking refuge from the madness of your world, you will grant them the same sanctuary you gave my daughter. I promise, Kane said without hesitation. Years passed. The legend of the quiet man in the desert dojo spread. His sanctuary became a bridge between two worlds. Settlers and Apaches, who had only ever met in violence, found a neutral ground where disputes could be settled with words instead of bullets. Kane never grew rich, but he grew rich in respect. On a warm afternoon, nearly a decade later, Kane, now with more silver than black in his ponytail, watched as 3 young Apache boys practiced their Aikido rolls on the mat. They were clumsy but enthusiastic, their laughter echoing in the still air. A woman stood watching from the veranda. It was Nita, now a confident and respected leader among her people. Beside her stood her own young son, who watched the boys with wide, curious eyes. She caught Kane's gaze and smiled, a smile of shared history and profound gratitude. The simple act of kindness in the desert had not just saved one life. It had planted a seed of understanding that had grown into a mighty tree, offering shade to all who sought it. Courage, Kane knew, was not about the will to fight. It was about having the wisdom to know when to open your door to a lost child, and in doing so, opening a door to peace. What do you think? Is true strength the power to defeat an enemy, or the wisdom to make a friend of one? Kane chose his path, but the world is full of different conflicts. Share your thoughts in the comments, and as always, please comment with respect for all perspectives. If this story of honor and understanding moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it. We have many more tales of unexpected heroes waiting to be told.